Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast. Tonight, we're joined by Frederick Turner, who is a poet, literary critic, philosopher, and environmental theorist who has written several science fiction epic poems. Fred, thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's good to be with you. In fact, I want to find out more about your organization. It sounds like just the kind of thing I want to contribute to.
Oh, yeah, we are happy to get into that. First, let's hear a little bit about your background, your interests, and what brought you to working on the problems you're trying to solve.
Well, I was raised in Central Africa by my parents, Victor and Edie Turner, who are sort of fairly well-known anthropologists. And and moved, as an anthropology brat, moved around quite a bit. And so I always felt that I was a sort of global person. And in fact, one of my most interesting experiences was coming back to England after having been in Africa for 3 years and feeling somewhat suspicious of all those weird white people.
I feel the same way for what it's worth.
Yeah, we'd lived in an African village, and I learned the language and got to know the kids and the rituals and that sort of thing. And while I was out there, I had the kind of classic sort of epiphanic experience. Sitting in my dad's truck, driving through on the dirt roads of central Zambia, we drove through a grove of wild plum trees. The plum is called the mfungu, and I suddenly had this. I was about 11, I suppose, and I had this sort of astonished vision of the world around me. I mean, it wasn't sort of hyper real or anything like that. It was absolutely real. And what amazed me was that all the leaves were perfectly made, that all the fruits were perfectly made,
yeah.
That, the sky was perfectly made, everything. And I knew enough by then about science that everything was pretty perfectly made all the way down to the molecules and the atoms and so on. And I was simply astonished. I mean, it was a sense of amazement, and you could call that a religious experience. How did it all get here? If you wanted to build a leaf, a real leaf, you'd have to spend the gross national product for a couple of years.
Yeah.
I mean, and then what immediately followed on the heels of that was that there was something in here, in my mind, in my brain, in this piece of meat and bone, that was experiencing it. It was an I that was experiencing it. Now, obviously, both of those experiences are experiences of absolutely ordinary things. But they struck me as absolutely extraordinary. And the whole of the rest of my life, I've been trying to, in one way or another, explain the extraordinariness of it. And being a poet was my way of doing it. And it also pushed me into immense curiosity about all of nature. And I've always been interested in most of the major branches of science. And
So it was when you were 11 years old, that's when you decided you wanted to terraform Mars?
The terraforming of Mars sort of grew originally out of that. It was, I suppose, I was, my thought at that time was, what would it take to build one of these? What would it take to build that place in Africa with the fruit trees? Supposing you had to build it from the ground up. And so that was my first introduction to ideas about evolution and so on. And but it was also, in a sense, a precursor to the idea of let's see what you'd have to do with a planet that didn't have the fruit trees. How would you build one? And so that was when I started thinking about terraforming. Oh. But that was many, many years later.
So you straddle this really interesting line between science and aesthetics. And I have several questions about what that's like for you and kind of how you ended up there. But first I wanted to ask, why do you think so few people do this? It's not impossible to find serious researchers in the hard sciences who like poetry, or serious researchers in the humanities with a good knowledge of thermodynamics, but it's very rare. Do you have any thoughts as to how this gap opened up?
Well, clearly, it's the CP Snow two cultures, and that has been around for a long time. I think it goes back, in some ways, at least academically, it goes back to the German, the origins of the German university, at least of the modern German university, where and it went back to which goes back to a philosophical problem. And the philosophical problem is, if the universe is a piece of absolutely deterministic clockwork, if it could be perfectly predicted by a Laplace calculator, which would have all the vectors and masses and so on of all the particles in the universe. If that's the case, then the whole realm of the humanities, which are all based upon freedom and open futures and alternatives and so on, would be an illusion. And so, Kant writes Kant is trying to deal with that problem, particularly when it comes to ethics. But the only way to deal with it at first seemed to be to separate the Geisteswissenschaft, the knowledge or wisdom about the mind, from Naturwissenschaft, knowledge, wisdom, science of nature. And I think it was a huge mistake. It was a mistake because they didn't at that time realize that the whole question of causality is extremely complicated. And since then, we've come to talk about nonlinear dynamical systems and radical unpredictability in many, many scientific fields. And that the world does seem to be sort of making itself up as it goes along, rather than filling out a foregone conclusion. That choice is part of nature. That time is branchy. That at a given time, if you look back over time, it looks like a line of events. But when you look forward, in fact, there's a whole spray of possible outcomes that can come out of the present moment. And the world is time itself is a dynamical creative process, and it even generates itself, as I found out later through reading the work of J.T. Fraser, that time itself evolves. At the beginning of the universe, in the Big Bang, So it would have been nonsense to talk about concepts like past, present, and future, or even earlier and later, or before and after. Those sorts of concepts would make no sense. You had to have really, the emergence of energy and the emergence of matter and the emergence of life for some of those essential elements of time to evolve. And that, again, it seems to me to indicate the need for a profound change in our educational system to bring Naturwissenschaft and Geisteswissenschaft back together again. And that's been a large part of my own work as an academic and as a poet.
Yeah, so some of the work that I've done in the past, I focus on a lot of what I refer to as unanswerable questions.
Yeah.
Now, if I was going to design the universe, I would want everything to work right every time. And yet we seem to have an exception to every rule. And I keep coming back to this question of why do we have an exception to every rule? It makes life much more interesting, but nothing works quite as we originally had planned.
Yes, time is real.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a problem, it's not just an epistemological problem, it's not just a problem with our knowledge. I think it's a problem that the universe is itself trying to deal with, crises and paradoxes arise all the time. It as thresholds, new kinds of thresholds are crossed. And if one looks at just the evolution of the four forces of physics, one can see that if you get certain increases of magnitude in certain directions, supergravity cannot hold together. It has to bifurcate, and eventually four forces, the electromagnetism, the weak and strong nuclear forces, have to emerge out of that original sort of primary super force. So the evolutionary process begins at the Big Bang. And so one of the things I've been interested in is the nature of what I would call thresholdiness. That is, and this is fundamental to time. That is, if anything accumulates or keeps on going for long enough in an iterative kind of way, it's going to run up against fundamental problems. It's going to have to bifurcate, and it's going to enter into chaotic regimes, which then involve strange attractors and new kinds of self-organizing systems come into existence. So, in other words, that fundamental imperfection is precisely the nature of time. And if one wanted to be theological about it, one could say that is the divine principle. It's a principle of imperfection.
Well, I don't know if I want to be theological about it, but I might be teleological about it. So you said that that was perfect setup.
But teleology implies a goal that you're going towards.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. So
a teleogenic process. It's a process that creates teleology.
Okay, well, let's get into that then, because the way you phrased it earlier in response to one of Thomas's questions was that there's a sense in which the universe is trying to grapple with certain deep metaphysical issues, or I guess epistemological doesn't really apply here, but I think you see what I'm pointing at. So would you say that the universe is evolving towards a goal? What are these teleogenic processes that are at play, which you've elucidated in your work?
Yeah, I don't think it's, as I say, I don't think it's that it's evolving towards a goal. I mean, I like Teilhard de Chardin, and that would be a sort of a Christian religious way of looking at the process. But it seems to me that it's a teleogenic process, and what I mean by that is that it doesn't, although, how can I put it, locally and temporarily, it is goal oriented. I mean, even in the simple sense that, you know, a piece of massive matter will tend to gravitate towards another piece of matter, you know. Dante says the force that moves the sun and the other stars.
Right.
But and of course, you know, any living organism has all kinds of priorities and drives and tropisms and so on. Desire goes all the way down, I think, as far as living organisms is concerned. But in the larger sense, the universe doesn't just, as it were, attempt to fulfill its tropisms or its desires. It tends to generate new kinds of tropisms and desires at higher levels of organization. You know, more and more self-reflexive systems made up of lesser reflexive systems all the way down, so to speak.
So Trent and I live in Colorado, and we're not too far from the National Institute of Standards.
Yes.
And they're the place where the keeper of all the standards. Now, we've had some discussions in the past about if you go to another planet, very few of these standards apply on another planet. When you go to another planet, the gravity is different there, so all the weights and most of the measurements will change. Just the atmosphere is different. The day-night cycles are different. The predators are different. Just everything there is different. And so I don't know. Personally, I've kind of come to the conclusion that there's no other human-like creatures on other planets, just because there's all of the different variables that'll be there. There might be other life forms, but they won't be human-like. And so Hollywood's fascination with putting extra wrinkles on somebody's forehead and calling them an alien is far from the truth. And so this so we're tend to view everything through an earthly lens as we look at the universe around us. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Well, it does seem to me that there is, you know, again, a kind of hierarchy of constants, ranging from the very local to the very to the universal. Obviously, on another planet, pi is still going to be pi. Phi is still going to be phi. The speed of light, you know, is E is probably still going to be E. You know, in terms of candle power, or, you know, the way in which things diminish with distance optically, that's going to be constant. And then there are going to be things that are very likely. That is, I would think it's probably pretty unlikely that there would be life on another planet that wasn't generally ecological and evolutionary, that didn't have some kind of balance between commensality and competition. If you go, you know, on other planets, if there's any kind of economic system, it's probably going to involve something like, markets. it, at the same time, obviously, there are going to be absolutely radical differences. I have an unpublished novel at the moment that I'm sort of trying to sell, which is about the exploration of Europa, and Europa has an ocean that is, I think, twice as 2 or 3 times the volume of all the Earth's oceans put together, and it's been around for as long as the Earth has been around. It has plentiful sources of energy, and under its ice, I think it's 10 or 20 kilometer thick ice cap. There is a warm ocean, and my question would be, well, what kind of life would evolve in it? What would it be like? If we think of earthly aquatic life, octopuses and mollusks and cetaceans and so on are highly intelligent. They might have made it before we did if it hadn't been for certain kinds of accidents. So the novel really is a kind of as much as I could make it, a sort of, from a point of view of chemistry and energy budgets and known principles of evolution and ecology and so on. What would it be like if life had evolved there? But then, of course, there are things which are absolutely different. There's no light there, pretty much. So you wouldn't, the major sense would, of course, be hearing and echolocation.
So you're saying that this is a how-to novel?
Sort of, yeah. And then, of course, there would also be, if you had a civilization there, its cosmology would be very much like the medieval cosmology, because the edge of the world, I mean, anybody that tried to, a living creature under the ice that tried to burrow outwards would be, as soon as it got to the surface, it would be instantaneously fried by the radiation and of course sucked dry fried by the radiation of Jupiter and sucked dry by the vacuum. So no explorer would come back to tell the tale that there is something else outside the edge of the universe. So it would be the edge of the outside. That would be the whole universe. So, and so one would, in other words, one might be able to infer the kind of life that one might get on another planet, at least by some kind of analogy with ours, but it would be radically different.
One of the questions I like to ask is the series of thoughts or breakthroughs or experiments a person in a situation would need to undertake in order to achieve a broader field of vision. Like, for example, on Twitter, Michael Nielsen has done this thought experiment of what would it have taken for a Roman mathematician to have come up with calculus or something like that. So given the limitations of Roman numerals, what's the series of thoughts that might have led a person not to invent Arabic numerals, but to have invented calculus from within that system? And then you get a feel for the constraints of a given set of symbols or a given way of thinking about things. And so as you were telling the story from your novel about the explorers on Europa and in the oceans, I'm wondering what might they have needed to do in order to have discovered that there's this universe, that it has known principles that can be discovered and elucidated and worked within, and eventually that they could even escape the ocean. Like, would you care to riff on that, how they might have escaped from the medieval cosmology?
Well, one of the premises of it, of the novel, was that it had achieved a very advanced civilization, but had not yet been able to break their way out. And we have it easy because we can actually see the universe out there at night, and we made all kinds of hypotheses about it and so on. But and we also had some conception that if you get high enough, it gets very cold and very hard to breathe, and so on. That there was, as it were, a ramp that we could go up to get off the planet. We could, look at the pressure of the air and so on, and so on. But they would have no ramp really, because I suppose they could burrow upwards to a point where they would be able to measure the radiations, so to speak, the radiation, although even their radiation science would be very primitive. Their bubble science would be fantastic. I mean, they would do fantastic things with bubbles, and collapsing bubbles, and explosive compression and that kind of thing. But they wouldn't be able to. Radio would be very difficult for them. But if they got really advanced, working through principles, they might be able to measure the kind of danger and the kind of pressure that would be up there. And then they would have to design heavy protective measures, garments or whatever, to protect them when they got out. But it would be it would take a very, very kind of advanced theoretical civilization to be able to do that. They might be able to infer. The other thing is, of course, they would have huge tides there, which, of course, what generates a lot of the energy underneath the ice. And so they might infer from the nature of the tides the influences, the gravitational influences of Jupiter and Io and Callisto and so on. So that might give them a theoretical grasp that there might be other bodies out there, rather than that the tides were simply provided by God.
Right.
Yeah. So throughout history, we've had several examples of, like the Romans, as an example, came up with Roman numerals, and that was a system that was inherently flawed.
Yes.
And that prevented them from doing any higher math, and they would have never gotten to calculus using Roman numerals.
Yes.
Because every number itself, they didn't have a placeholder system.
They needed the zero. Yeah.
Yeah. And so every number was an equation, and that prevented them from doing any higher math.
Yes.
And so we tend to shoot ourselves in the foot a lot. And I always like to ask the question of what systems do we have today that are the equivalent of Roman numerals that are preventing us from doing great things? And
a great question.
Yeah, that's a
great question.
Yeah, and so I always think about any life form on some other planet would stub their toe on similar problems like this.
Yes.
They wouldn't come up with the elegant solution right off the bat.
I think one of our big problems is we're also able to do all kinds of wonderful things with it, but is the analogy between time and space. It's the idea of the t-axis, which I think is a fundamental hindrance to our thinking. That time is like a line only in the limited world of classical dynamics. Certainly, time is like a line in terms of being able to predict eclipses of the moon.
Right.
But time was not like a line in the quantum world, is not like a line in the quantum world. it's not like a line in any kind of non-linear dynamical chemical system, and certainly not in life. Or one would have to start thinking about a sort of a curved line, a timeline that could be curved itself, or even a timeline that could have volume itself, in order to be able to get some kind of to continue the analogy, but we don't. And the again, as I say, branching timelines. That would be another attempt to deal with it. And in fact, interestingly enough, our grammatical system for indicating tense is really a wonderful system for analysis of branches. It's a kind of branched time theory. If you think about sort of, if I had done something back at that point, then 5 years from now, I will have been able to do this, so the language is in a sense wiser than our physics. And I think time for me is the most interesting question.
So as working as a futurist, one of the questions that I'm wrestling with is this idea of our relationship with the future, and where does the future come from? Do we have like a staging area for each piece of the future, and we're experiencing it like like a 50 frames per second, and then once we experience it, then it goes somewhere. It goes from the future to the present to the past, and then is there like a large holding tank for all of the spent presents that we have no use for anymore?
Yeah. Well, in fact, since because of the speed of light, and therefore the speed of information, there's a whole lot of information, for instance, that is coming at us from Alpha Centauri, or from the center of the galaxy, and so on, that hasn't happened yet as far as we're concerned.
Right.
In fact, everything we experience is experiencing in the past, even if it's by a few microseconds. And of course, it takes a bit of a time for the brain to process it.
Sure.
So it's already past by the time we experience it, which means, in a sense, that the whole universe is filled with waves and packets of past. It's absolutely chock full of them, flying through us at every in every microsecond. And so in a sense, you could say that it's what Faulkner said, the past isn't even past. The past is always already here. That, we maybe ought to think about the present as a kind of an accumulation of the past, or a growth of the past. St. Augustine called it distension, a kind of distending of the past.
So then the natural question is how much control do we have? I mean, if these inertias, these things have already started 100 million light years away, pass through our atmosphere and affect how we do things, how much of the variables do we control ourselves?
Well, a very great deal. I mean, it seems to me that, engineering, for instance, and art and so on, we do a lot of controlling. Agriculture and so on. And then, there are the ways in which we can, deflect and manipulate and so on the momentum of all of these past processes. But then we're also perfectly capable of making up out of just for fun, so to speak, making up things which become that have physical causal power in the future, like, for instance, the United States Constitution, or the rules of the game of chess, or any actual any performative statement, illocutionary act, in which we make something true by saying it, like, with this ring I thee wed, or Congress hereby enacts this bill into law, or if I'm the dealer at poker, red threes are wild, I say, well, we're going to play 7 cards stud and red threes are wild. It's a silly game, but as long as for this performative community, red threes are wild. And I have said it just as God says, "Let there be light" in the Bible.
Okay.
That we can make up things which change everything. And for me, this is also a kind of biological reality, because in a sense, if you think of, for instance, limestone, which is now a very factual part of the earth and very important part of the earth, limestone was sort of invented by early forms of mollusk life. The world is different because of the strange inventiveness of DNA.
Yeah, I often say that there's several aspects of our universe that I can predict with high degrees of probability.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
I can predict that the Earth's going to travel around the sun in roughly the same orbit 100 years from now, with a high degree of probability.
Yeah.
And 50 years from now, we'll still have the summer, winter, spring, and fall, and the rising and lowering of tides, and even if I throw a handful of seeds into the ground, a certain percentage of them will spring to life.
Yes.
And so most of our future is being constructed around slow, stable, moving parts, and but then the things that are the least predictable are dealing with humans and animals and like weather.
Yes.
And so, to the degree that you can get better at predicting them, then it gives you a lot more understanding of what the future holds.
Yes, and predicting is the game. But of course, the problem with predicting is that when you have more than one predictor, you're into a kind of you're immediately into kind of infinite regresses of second guessing.
Right.
Of course, we're better at it than the animals are, which is why we can outsmart them. But but we can't really outsmart each other.
Before the time of the atomic clock, we used to say if you had one clock, you knew what time it was. If you had two, you were never sure.
Exactly. Right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you then have the situation of a kind of competitive but also cooperative process of prediction. We're in a sort of competitive cooperative predicting contest.
Right.
And that contest isn't just one. It's not just epistemological. It's not just a matter of knowledge. It's a matter of being itself. I mean, it doesn't just predict the future. It in some ways determines the future.
So you're do you have classes going on right now?
Well, I'm emeritus now. I retired last year, but I mean I still take part in some university functions, and I continue an academic life. But my school, we're teaching. We have virtual classes, and I think with considering going back to a full residential system in the fall.
Okay. All right. Now, how do you anticipate the university system evolving in the post-COVID world?
Oh boy, yeah, fascinating.
I didn't mean to stump you or anything.
No. I mean, it's a wonderful question, and I've been thinking about it. I'm in general, it seems to me that what this has done is it has alerted us to the possibility of cottage industry. One of the big sociological problems has, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, has been the separation between home and work. And this has in many ways been disastrous for children because they're to a large extent separated from the work lives of their parents. And the whole process of apprenticeship kind of has gone right down the tubes in all kinds of ways.
Right.
And out of that separation comes, for instance, urban congestion, paving everything in order for people to get from one place to another, and so on and so on. But now we're in a situation where we have such good software that we're more and more into being able to, how can I put it? If you think of, for instance, 3D printing, and local programmable machine tools and that sort of thing, you do not need any more great big factories where thousands of people come in and work on an assembly line. It may turn out that it's, we're going to have a vital industrial future that would be something like, let's say, the wool and textile industry in England in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and so on, where people were doing high value, or like, say, olive and vine growing in the Mediterranean, where you could have very great deal of entirely local industry without having to have without having to have a proletariat, really.
Right.
And it seems to me that we'd have to think about the future of education in relation to all that, and what would the education be for? Now, of course, we do need we as human beings, I think, do need to get together in large numbers. We do need to have concerts, and we do need to have plays. We need to have collective rituals, and so on. And we go to think of the Greek city-states and their theater and so on. I mean, there are all kinds of wonderful possibilities. I think religion probably does need. There probably are ways in which we can sort of be in touch with the divine that are collective rather than just individual. And by divine, I simply mean sort of any system that is to us as our neurons are, how can I put it? The divine is to us as the mind is to the neurons of the brain. I mean, I don't rule out the possibility of there being a larger kind of integration of stuff than the highest thing we know, which is a human individual. But
One of the things I talk about
Yeah.
a lot lately is that we're reducing the distance between the expert and the learners,
Yes.
um, and we're doing that digitally. And as a result of that, we're seeing this competition growing between certifications and college degrees.
Yes.
So for so many people, it's so much easier to just get a certification. In the tech world, cares far less about academic credentials
Yes.
than some of the other industries do,
Yes.
and so they've been kind of leading the charge, so to speak, in this movement towards more certifications. And if somebody has to shift gears later on in life, it's not this onerous thing of going back to for another 2 years or 4 years to re-credential yourself. It might be a
Yes.
month or two or three
Yeah,
to get recertified.
I buy that, and that would, in a sense, as it were, leave to education, the true function of education as opposed to training,
Right, right.
which is the ability to synthesize, to make rational judgments that take into account the wisdom of the heart and so on.
Right, right. Yeah. Um, well, I'm absolutely fascinated by all the topics that you're tackling and the way your mind works and you think about things. You're coming at every issue from 100 different angles and trying to understand it from every possible perspective. I think that's impressive because so few people have that ability to do that. Um, and so I think uh, we're losing a lot by you not being on center stage at the university anymore.
Well, I put in my time. I taught for 53 years, so
Yeah. Only 53, huh? Okay.
um, but one can write books and so on, and I intend to write quite a few more before I hand in the dinner pail. Um, and it sounds, I mean, you're obviously, the same kind of being, it seems to me, and the futurati, are.
Yeah.
I feel that they're my tribe,
Yeah.
um, but I certainly do. I certainly do feel that polymathy is kind of important because, and I'm sure this is a familiar thing for you guys, but that the most of the kind of big problems in any one discipline are probably beautifully solvable in some neighbor discipline, and sometimes not even a neighbor discipline.
Yeah, well, we still haven't solved the problem of human aging yet, so I'm gonna
Human
human aging.
human aging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if it is a problem, I mean, in a way, yeah, oh boy, this is dangerous stuff. But
Yeah, our aging creates urgency. I mean, we have
yeah,
so many years to get things done.
yes, 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 and so many things that one hopes one lives to see.
Right.
Uh, but at the same time, I sort of like the Hindu, the Vedic kind of system of the stages of life. And I think that there is a kind of sannyasihood, which I have
Yeah.
not yet achieved. So which would really be, the contemplation of the bamboo leaves and the let's say the full detachment of full de- freedom from the attachment to the chattering anecdote that is one's surface conscious life, so to speak.
Okay.
You know, one hears one's own voice all the time going, and
Yes.
and you know, for me, it's not a bad voice, but sometimes I'm much happier when it is silent. You know.
Well, it sounds like there would be a circle of life component to that, because at 11 in Central Africa, you had this awakening to the beauty and magnificence and splendor of the world around you. And now, 60 years later, you're looking at wanting to get back to contemplating the bamboo leaves.
Exactly. Yeah, there's an old Buddhist saying that the child looks at the mountain and sees the mountain. The man looks at the mountain and sees 10,000 things. The sage looks at the mountain and sees the mountain.
Yeah.
At the end of the 10 bulls, you start out sort of hewing wood and drawing water, and then you go in pursuit of the mystical bull, and through tremendous sort of spiritual discipline, you manage to catch up with the bull, but at the end you go back to hewing wood and drawing water. But you're not just hewing wood and drawing water, you're hewing wood and drawing water.
So speaking of coming at things from different angles, you often choose to explore scientific subjects through an artistic lens. And I wondered if you would speak a little bit about what is added by that approach. And just to flesh out some context for our audience, you've written several epic poems on the fallout of climate change, on the terraforming of Mars, on the future of America. And I'm just curious as to what is added to that by exploring it through an artistic medium. And I'm also curious as to why epic poetry is a good vehicle for that exploration, as opposed to just a science fiction novel like Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah, I think so. No, I mean, I'm a huge devotee of science fiction, and I do have a science fiction novel. My first science fiction novel, A Double Shadow, did pretty well. But the thing about poetry is that it has a kind of density and elusiveness, metaphoricity, that makes it very, very much richer than regular prose, in my opinion. And it's also been it's been the way in epic is the way in which human beings make grand narratives. I mean, one of my books is epic form, content, and history. And I studied 60 or 70 epics from different parts of the world, and found out in the process, of course, that any coherent civilization that had something like the equivalent of a city has either created an epic or is in the process of creating an epic. That is something that human beings do, like singing or drawing pictures of things, or making poetry. One of my discoveries, I suppose, with a German neuroscientist was the universality of poetic meter. That all human beings compose poetry, all human societies compose poetry. They all do it in lines, as opposed to just a continuous thread. And the lines are always about 3 seconds long. And this corresponds perfectly to the actual information present of that is now a standard in cognitive neuroscience. And so, and that the repetition of that most natural rhythm of information causes changes in brain state that make us more able to escape the denotative and get into the connotative, to try to read not for the literal but for the metaphorical. And so poetry is that richer medium. And now, obviously, there have been huge changes in media as we've in our human history, and each time there's a big change in media, usually there's a kind of outburst of epic writing, epic composing. So we go from the oral epic of Homer and pre-Homer, that has been so wonderfully studied by Lord and Parry and by other people, and then then you have the written epic, of say Virgil, Dante, the Popol Vuh, the Mahabharata. And then you have the print epic with Paradise Lost and Torquato Tasso and the Heike and the Prelude, and then of course the science fiction epics, the Foundation series, and Dune, and film. And then you have film epic, Lord of the Rings and 2001 Space Odyssey, Star Wars, and so on. So we've had a kind of evolution of epic, but epic is the way that we make grand narratives. That is the kind of super narratives that are so capacious that they can contain dozens or hundreds of little narratives and put them into context with each other, so that any of the tribes that make up the city find themselves a place in that grand narrative. Now, I think the novel doesn't do that. The novel is always, I think, sort of trapped, however great it can be, is trapped within a particular social world. And after the characters have gone through all of their extraordinary and beautiful and terrible activities, the waters of the society close over them. Now, there are novels that are epic. I think War and Peace and Moby Dick and so on, they rise above that characteristic of the novel, but that makes them into kind of monsters in terms of the novel. That's what Joyce was trying to do with Finnegan's Wake. Maybe the natural way for human beings to make a big story that is able to, within whose language all the different languages of a given society can make themselves mutually understood. I think that would be a way of saying it. The epic is the way that we do that. And I think a lot of our modern problems with modernism and postmodernism and the death of God and so on have been the loss of such a great narrative. Now, I think science has given us the basis for a new grand narrative, a new evolutionary grand narrative for human beings. And it seems to me that we have the opportunity to have another go at it.
Are you familiar with Yuval Harari's work?
I've heard. He's on my list, but no, I haven't. I haven't explored it yet. But in fact, I wrote a note. That is really strange. I wrote a note to myself about it today. This is something I need to
serendipity. Yeah.
So please tell me.
In his book *Sapiens*, he advances the thesis that part of what allows human societies to operate at super Dunbar numbers is our ability to spin these fictions that coordinate us. They give us a series of Schelling points to coordinate around. They give us a shared vision, and this is part of the glue that kind of holds everyone together. And some of your comments about epics and how natural they are, and how every society that's risen to the level of a city produces them, because it gives all the different social strata, the different cliques, the different clusters of humanity, a shared narrative space in which to find themselves, in which to identify with their fellow man, with their civilization, and thereby to kind of advance all their interests in unison. It sort of reminded me of the line of evidence that he adduces in favor of that thesis in that book.
That's wonderful. That's what I was trying to talk about in my book about epic. I think that in a sense, if there is a successor to modernism and postmodernism, I think it has to be, in a sense, the recreation of an epos that is not for a particular culture or society, but is now for the planetary culture, the planetary society. And that has to be, obviously a huge effort of combination a drama. It can't be monologic. It has to be dialogic. It has to take into account many different kinds of voices and different kinds of inspirations.
The Apollonian, the Dionysian.
Yeah.
So it sounds like one of the major themes sort of running through your work is that long ago, science and the rise of mechanistic science in particular became so thoroughly conquered epistemology in the way we think about things that it sort of drove this wedge between itself and the humanities. And that in the modern age, part of what we need to do is rediscover the epic form and explore science through it as a way of sort of breathing a holy fire back into the mechanisms of the universe. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Beautifully said, too.
I've been working on it for like a minute or two.
The holy fire. I may steal that.
I would like to ask you one question about the process you go through when you're writing.
Yes.
I mean, do you have to dress in a white robe and pull out your Smith Corona typewriter and set with 2 hours early in the morning with the light coming through a certain window?
Plum leaves.
I love it. I'm at the moment. I've gone back. I'm reading Anthony Trollope novels. So,
oh wow.
Okay.
I mean, I've always loved Anthony Trollope, and I just decided to reread some of them. And Trollope would get up at like 5 o'clock in the morning, and he would start writing. He would write for, I think, exactly 2 hours, and then just stop wherever he was.
Okay.
It's for me. It depends entirely on the kind of genre that I'm working in. If I'm writing lyric poetry, if I'm writing short poems, then I basically just have to drop everything and either sketch it down and then try to turn it into good verse, or if I've got enough time, to chisel it out at the time, and I can do that on the back of an envelope, more kind of metaphorically, or on a cell phone.
Okay.
When I'm working on a longer work, I really have to have a routine, and I'm at my best in the morning. And so I will, I'll work, more or less from breakfast time to noon. And then I'm pretty much spent for anything kind of particularly creative after that. With occasional essays, it's somewhere in between. I mean, sometimes I'm getting, I get sort of commissions for various things, reviews and that sort of thing. I usually do those when I've got, when I'm at a loose end, when there isn't something that that I immediately have to do, as a kind of avocation, as it were.
Okay. Yeah, everybody's different in how they think about the task that lies before them when it comes to pulling words out of their mind and putting them on paper, so to speak. Well, this has been an absolute joy talking to you here tonight.
Oh, me too. I mean, I'm going to have to. I'll look at the various links and so on in the correspondence, and I'm going to sort of start kibitzing. I think.
Yeah. Well, in the futurist world, we're always trying to stay ahead of the curve, and sometimes my head hurts when I start thinking about things that are just coming down the pike, like non-fungible tokens
NFTs,
right now. Yeah, NFTs.
Yes.
And the first time I heard that, I said, "Okay, what the hell is that?" And and so
the whole blockchain thing, and
oh yeah,
it was amazing.
That's fabulous. Yeah.
So I love the learning challenge involved in all of this. That's what I find fascinating. But I want to thank you for being our guest tonight. This has been absolutely wonderful. So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
Well, I have a blog, frederickturnerpoet.com, I do have a university email address, which is, it's just fturner@utdallas.edu, and that will get me.
Okay. All right.
Fantastic.
Well, very good. All right. Well, thank you for joining us tonight. And
thank you. Well, great questions, and
I feel
nice
very
to meet
honored to be in your presence. So.
Oh, shucks.
All right. Well, thank you.
I feel very much the same way.